Well, good evening, everybody. It's really interesting to do some research into this and to talk about the boats. I've heard a lot of, with interest, the previous discussions from various contributors, but nobody's really mentioned very much about the boats. And somehow or other, they seem to, exception of Harman, miss out the third hand. And I felt the third hand possibly should be mentioned. So I have a few things to say about how we sail the 81 and some of the more amusing things we got up to. But I'm afraid that at this stage of my life, my first recollection of a Shannon One Design is probably about 1949, when the family moved to live in the Phoenix in Drummondere. And my father at that stage had bought the 61 a year previously. And the 61 had been built by Walter Leving in 1937, I think it was. And that was the first boat we actually sailed in. John One Design, as you all know, were designed by Morgan Giles in the 1920s, early 1920s. And it was designed to be a one design sailing boat to sail and to row. Now, I suspect that Morgan Giles never tried to row a Shannon One Design because they're a terribly difficult boat to row, but they do sail really very well. They're a hand-built boat, obviously. They comprise about 150 pieces of wood. Each piece has got to be selected to do the job, then cut, then planed, then shaped, and then fitted, and all eventually make what are these lovely boats. And they also look very attractive when they're all put together. So I think if we go to slide number 2, please, Naomi. This gives you a good example of the 61. This is the second 61. My father had the first 61 built by Lomax, and Lomax did not use very good timber, particularly in the keel of the original 61. And that keel rotted way back as far as the centerboard box. So when I brought the boat to Dougal, he gave me the telephone call, which everybody dreads. Reggie, I think you should come and look at your boat. And when I went up to Ballyman, the boat was there and stripped back, and the rot was all the way back to just the beginning of the centerboard box. And most of the planks had rotted back from the stem because he had not used the correct timber in the stem. And he had used softwood in the keel. So I decided that I'd get the new 81 boat built and use what I could of the old boat. So quite a lot of the old boat was actually used. You can see the centerboard box is there for a start, the plate, the spars, the rudder, and some of the other fittings. But this is an example of a boat in build. And there's one point I just want to show to you here. Well, in this particular photograph, if you look where the gloves are, the glued gloves, you'll see the forward thwart, and the hole has not been drilled yet in that for the mast. But if you look really closely over at where it sits on the two bearers, what we did on that boat was we just notched in the thwart. We cut a slight rebate so the thwart dropped down, and the bearer, the thwart was taking the full compression load when the boat was sailing, particularly on the wind. And there is a lot of pressure here, and there's an awful lot of pressure from the mast. And this is, I think, a weakness in all these boats. But if you look at the more modern boats, they actually, Dougal built that slight recess in, and it's only about 4 or 5 millimeters, but it means that the thwart is actually doing the job, and the knees, which you can see are sticking up here, they haven't been cut off, they're helping the job. There's a lot of stress there. So if we go on to slide 3, thank you. I first am recorded in sailing in 1950. And I can prove that because my name is on the Tisdall Cup, which I managed to win that year. I think I was very carefully guided by Con Jackson because he was the sheet hand. I don't know who the crew was. And there were probably 7 or 8 boats taking part in that first juvenile race held in Lough. The cup had been presented by Mary Hooker. And it was always full of colourful race. You must remember that in those days there were no organised sailing courses. So it was a sort of very simple apprenticeship. You were put in the bow of a Shannon One Design and told to do what you were supposed to do. And nothing was ever very explained to you. And you eventually progressed from there. Totally unlike today where they have sailing courses and everything, the theory is taught and all the rest of it. So I sailed in that race, but I can remember one of those juvenile races around about that year when the wind blew fairly hard. And there was an almighty crash, and I looked behind, and it did resemble what I expect the Battle of Trafalgar sounded like, with the splinters and the bad language to match. It was quite entertaining. It's still in my mind. And of course, in those days, as I mentioned, we had no sailing courses. We had no life jackets. We had no foul weather gear. We had no buoyancy. There was no kicking straps. And the tow straps had actually been fitted by my father in 1948 because I've come across his log, which he kept of that year. This is a photograph of the 56, sailed by Posey Goodbody, my father's sheeting and my mother's in the bow, third hand. And they're sailing behind the Goose Island, as you can see, the Tinamara's there, the Foam, Lough, and a really interesting boat is the this naval pinnace, the Janet, and she is on the most important collection of British naval boats, the 100 most important boats in England. But she was on the Shannon. John Lefroy will know all about her, and other people will as well. And she has been beautifully restored and put back into steam, but that's an aside. So let's go on to the next slide, please. This, I was always taught that a Shannon One Design would actually float 3 people. And this is an example of it just about doing that, because the buoyancy has decided that there are better places to be and certainly not tied into this Shannon One Design. But if you capsize, the rule was you stayed with the boat. It's quite a good rule. It should have been applied in the Fastnet race for a lot of the yachts, but some people ignored that. But nowadays we obviously have buoyancy, and I'm going to come to buoyancy later on. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. This is the rebuilt 81 in Dougal's yard, and she's built in using clear Canadian spruce. Now, the earlier boats were all built out of European spruce, which grows in Sweden and Finland. And in those days, you could buy really good quality 7x3s, that's 7-inch by 3-inch, and you could get 4 planks out of that, or Walter probably got certainly 4, and that would make a Shannon. But the real reason why that's not used today is the fact that in those days they were known as unsorted quality, and you could get really good planks without too much knots. Nowadays it's all machine graded, and we never see that top quality timber. It's always kept in the Scandinavia. So now we're using this spruce. Spruce splits, whereas the European timber with a lot of knots is actually tougher and we can do just as good a job. So I think we'll go on to the next slide, please. This is an example of the hardwood. Now, it's not a good slide, I apologize about it. It's the same boat, same 81. But the thwarts and the centerboard box, rudder and tiller, they can be made out of mahogany. When we were building, or Eric was building his boat, we used Utili mahogany because it has nice clean grain. West African mahogany will also do, and it comes up very attractively, but it's got an interlocking grain, so it's difficult to get a really good finish on it. You can with really modern machines, but when you're hand working, it's very difficult. Brazilian mahogany is much lighter, and I did debate whether to use Brazilian, but I decided not to, because Brazilian mahogany is not very durable, and I reckon as we're putting a lot of money into a boat, you might as well try and get one to last. The one timber I would not like to use in a Shannon One Design is Iroko, but it has been used in several boats. The reason is that it's a rather coarse West African hardwood, and it doesn't hold varnish well. It'll always peel off. Both yacht clubs, by the way, are both finished in Iroko. Ribs, Irish oak is definitely the best. And one of the places to watch for your ribs is under the mast, because of the downward pressure, which I've already mentioned, you get a lot of pressure there and they crack. And I could not understand why 81 at one stage of our career was leaking so badly. And I put her into the water, took the floorboards out, everything was fine, not a drop coming in, put the sail up, went out, and the water poured in. So I then saw the pressure, the downward pressure was forcing open the planks, and of course the ribs had cracked underneath the mast step, and that's had opened it up, and a lot of boats leak very badly there. So if European gunnels, gunnels, European larch or Douglas fir, both very suitable, need to be clear, no knots. I always prefer Scotch gunnels for several reasons. One is they're wider, so therefore they're easier to sit on. The second is they have a fastening at the top of each rib. And the third thing is they look better and they deal with the stress. If you look at your boats, some of the boats that don't have Scotch gunnels, you'll find an awful lot of the copper nails are actually broken there, particularly if the boats have been sailed in hard weather. So rowlocks in preference to thole pins, and there's two reasons for that. One is that some of the older boats all had thole pins, and they had a bearing pad which sat on top of the gunwale. This weakened the gunwale, but not only that, it didn't allow the crew to slide along the gunwale to change the weight when that needed to be done when you're sailing the boat. So I always went for rowlocks and tried not to put anything into the outside gunwale. Now, the centerboard box on the modern boats are now go right forward under the mast. This obviously makes them much stronger. You've seen the Harman's photograph last week of the 32, and it had a huge twist on it because Sid was sitting, and Sid wasn't a very heavy individual, but I have seen other boats, photographs of other boats with extraordinary twists on them, and this is because they don't have the box going right forward onto the mast. So that's a very important point. Originally, the boat was designed with this type of box, but Walter Leving, I think, probably to save timber and obviously cost came into it, decided to make the short box, which did the job, but it wasn't as good a job. Now, the mast, there's a very important thing on the mast here, and I used to see it many times, the odd boats that came into the yard. If you actually look at the angle between the bottom of the foot of the mast and the top of the bearing point of the mast step, you'll see that it sits hard on the aft end. It doesn't sit perfectly, the full weight doesn't come down perfectly. So the stainless steel, or originally my father had brass plate with a shoe, would help that. But to make it even better, it's a good idea to put a small toughnell or some form of plastic wedge, and particularly slightly curved, and that allows this mast to go backwards and forwards, which helps the speed, particularly when you're off the wind. If we'd go on to the next slide, please, Naomi. Naomi, can you hear me? Now,
Reggie, do you want this one or the next one?
No, the next one now, please. Yeah. This is an example of a tiller that probably doesn't fit. And I'm going to deviate here slightly. The 81's tiller is a rather interesting piece of timber. It's by far the oldest piece of wood in the Shannon One Design class. And it should actually, if it's not being used, should be put up on the wall somewhere. Originally, it came from the bottom of Delany Harbour. It was a pile. The pile was sold off by some border works or somebody, and it was bought by a pig man who kept pigs up in Sallynoggin. And I heard about this piece of green heart, and I managed to scrounge the whole log off the pig man, took it down to Delany, set about cutting it up on the big inserted tooth 5-foot rack saw bench we had, and managed to completely wreck the blade. It is fantastic timber. It is very strong, it is very durable, it's used for dock piling, and it was also used for fishing rods. So I thought it would be a good idea to make it into a tiller. And so it does the job very well. The thing about this is this particular photograph is demonstrating how not to fit a tiller. A tiller should actually fit into the top of a rudder. And if you fit into the top of a rudder properly, and if you put a pin through the rudder and through the tiller, and then you just tie the pin there so it doesn't fall out, you don't lose your rudder and you don't lose your tiller. But lump hammers seem to be a major part of the equipment of this particular boat. Normally they're used by people who have barges, liffey tugs, possibly, and block layers who build houses, but they shouldn't really be seen anywhere near a Shannon. Maybe another comment about tillers, it's impossible to race a Shannon One Design without a tiller extension, unless it's very calm weather. Now, the spars, Canadian spruce, aircraft quality, and the reason it's called aircraft quality, it's the same spruce, by the way, as used as a hull, but aircraft quality spruce is Canadian. It's because they're grown very large trees and they're slow grown, they're absolutely clear of knots for a long way up. And they were used during the war to make a lot of the aircraft during the war, the bombers particularly. It's fantastic timber, but it has a few peculiarities, one of which I told you, it's inclined to split. And the second thing is that you can make a lovely set of spars, and then it really gets dried out and they take the shape like a dog's leg, and there's nothing you can do about it except cut them up and use them as something else. If you put GRP bands around a mast, it actually makes them stiffer. Anybody who has a fishing rod will know that. But that's it also is a wear point, but it actually makes them stiffer. Eventually, a mast is going to break, and it has to break because if tests have been done on timber, if you continuously press timber backwards and forwards the way we do with our Shannon mast, particularly when you're running, it will give up the ghost and it just snaps, and an awful lot of them do, and people are always very surprised. Douglas fir has been used in some masts. It's much heavier, it is stiffer, but the masts I had were spruce, and sometimes it was European spruce. The yard and the boom on the 81 were the original, the yards were the original yards made for the 61, and they're made out of lovely, clear Canadian spruce. And then I had two booms, and one regatta at Lough, we were going along, and one of these booms, it really had, its time had come, and it had enough of life, and particularly of kicking straps, and it cracked. And I could actually see daylight through this boom. The gap was about 1/4 of an inch. And then the good lady who was sheeting applied the kicking strap, and the gap got wider. So at this stage, we had a little conference, and I suggested possibly we should stop using the kicking strap and try and finish the race and hold on to the few points that we were likely to get. That advice was taken, and we did finish the race without breaking the boom. Floorboards, they should be light, they should be well painted, and the top should be non-slip. well painted to stop them soaking up water and keep the boat a bit lighter. And while we're on keeping boats lighter, super suck balers, I've always had them. I don't know how old the ones were in the 81, but they were 20 or 30 years old. And the knack to keep those was to do two things. One was to put them down with your thumb and first finger and push them down. And then when you pull them up the same way, and then just use the stainless steel to lock them. But also a little bit of Vaseline 2 or 3 times a season on the inside and out makes them last a lot longer. So the plate on the 81 was originally 61's plate, and my father actually mentions in his diary that it was boilerplate. So that sort's another discussion. 08, the next slide, please, Naomi. The hull finish, I think this is a very important part, particularly when you're spending so much money on a boat. We're talking about new boats here. And the first thing I applied when I got the boat was clear cuprinol, inside and out. And the main reason for this is to stop a thing called blue stain coming into the timber. And it's a black stain. It doesn't reduce the strength of the timber, but it's very unsightly. And it gets in underneath the varnish work, and the whole thing looks horrible. Then a primer, and then that had been I always used international paints, primer, then fillet with a filler, then sand it, then undercoat, fillet again, undercoat, fillet again, until finally you get a perfectly good finish, and then give it two top coats of something like top lac. Finish is very important. If I was sitting in the boat one day and I was going along, it was very calm, very slow race. I could see another boat beside me, and it had a big bubble of paint sticking out of its paint. And the amount of turbulence in the water was quite extraordinary. So finish is really important. If you look at a Shannon One Design, to build it, you're going to use about 2,400 copper nails of one sort or another, and probably another 100 stainless steel screws. These are all areas where we let in water, and that's another good reason for cuprinoling a boat, because it stops the rot starting in the timber. Wood, when it dries, shrinks, but the copper nails don't. And then it's put into the water again the next season, and it expands, and the copper nails grip it, and everything's lovely and tight, and she doesn't sink any longer. And then it's taken out that season, and it dries again. But microscopically, the timber is slowly getting thinner. So eventually these boats all leak around the nails, particularly if they're not very well painted. And eventually they get very flexible, and eventually they'll have to be re-nailed. And you've got to debate whether that's worth doing. Don't use today's brass screws unless you get really good ones. They're very hard to get. The quality is very poor. It's either bronze or stainless steel. Shackles, just while we're on stainless steel, loosen, so they need to be tightened with the pliers. And if we go on to the next slide now, which will be, I think just go on, I'll tell you the Naomi, please. Sorry, that's a finish example of the finished hull, and you can see there's a reasonably good finish on that. And although the waterline isn't sharp there, I actually did the waterline with a laser. It got a perfectly good waterline. Now, go on to the next slide, please. This just gives you a close-up of a boat before she's been painted, and you can see all the fastenings I've been talking about. Next slide. Now, this is comes under rigging, and this is the second part. The rigging on 81, if you add up all the parts, and I did today from 3 different lists, there are over 100, probably 120, 130 different items, and that excludes the screws. That does include the ropes and the bits of main lashings. It doesn't include anything to do with the sail, by the way. And if you look at the rigging, the halyard, we start with the simple one. I always use 6mm Spectra with a timber band's hitch around the yard, led back to a block down at the foot of the mast, ahead of the mast to one side slightly. And then it comes back to this cleat, which you can see down on the bottom there. In fact, I've got a pointer cleat, and that cleat is angled particularly so that you can get the rope underneath it and then round it, and then just one hitch. And the reason why you have one hitch is that when it's underwater and you're capsized, you want to be able to undo the damn thing again. It's very difficult on doing 10 different turns and 10 half hitches all locked one on top of the other when you can't actually see what you're doing. You're trying to do it by feel. But then I improved it later on, and I put a rigging, a halyard lock, which is a yacht fitting, and I mounted it there, and I ran the halyard through the halyard lock, and it automatically locks. So as the person helping you rig the boat twangs out the halyard lock takes up the sign, and then you just make it off around the cleat just for safety. So that's the halyard. I gave up using the tackles and all the other various things which some people still use, but I didn't bother with them after a while. The next thing was the kicking strap. The kicking strap was a really interesting piece. When I was a 9 or 10-year-old, the kicking straps didn't exist on Shannon One Designs, and they used to roll spectacularly, and I've actually seen one boat roll right in. And in other cases, they did what's known as a Chinese jibe, when they jibed and the boom went right up near the mast and came crashing down on the other side and possibly rolled you in if you weren't quick enough. So eventually, other dinghies started developing kicking straps, and I think my father and Alf probably the first two to try them on the Shannon, and they've transformed it. But the kicking strap in the 81 does a second thing as far as I'm concerned. Not only does it control the mast, but if you work it right, you can actually get it to pull the bottom of the mast aft when you're running. And that makes these boats go faster. So to do that, originally we had a shoe with a metal loop, but I scrapped that, and I had the same shoe, and I put a bolt through it. And then I put a simple Kevlar loop running around the bottom of the mast, only probably about 9 or 10 inches. And the block which took the kicking strap wire could follow the angle of the boom as the boom swung in or swung out from the boat, if you can follow me. And to stop it riding up the mast, it was just under the nut of the bolt. And that was a vast improvement. So when I pulled the kicking strap, I was pulling the mast back. So I did not attach the kicking strap to the centerboard box. If you look at the fitting, well, it came through as a guide, and then it came to a Harkan fitting here, which is a jam cleat, but it's at 90 degrees, so that the jam cleat could be operated by pulling it out, not pulling it aft. And I had one on either side, and an endless rope went through that and went back through the tackle and back, and it was tied off here. And that rope was looped and round the back and through and forward again. So that meant that you could always grab your kicking strap and you could adjust it from either side, which is very critical. Underneath it, I had the tack, and that is a jam cleat again with a small eye there. On the other side, I had the centerboard, and the kicking strap was on top. The reason why I had the centerboard on the other side was I'm right-handed, so the right hand was the strongest in those days. It's no longer quite so good. And that would allow me to get the plate up and down quickly. You'll also notice that all these controls are brought back to this particular part of the boat. And there's a reason for that. And we'll start with the crew. The crew haven't been mentioned except the unfortunate Harman, who had to sit and stop the waves in the 50 last week, most of his life. And now I see he's been demoted again by the sun and put back in the bow again. But anyway, you're a brave man, Harman, and I do admire you for doing that. I had my time before the mast as well with my father. And one occasion was so upset and so cross, I just felt like falling overboard and making sure he'd have to go back and collect me. But I didn't do that. But in the 81, the third hand job was ballast and information. In other words, what were other boats doing? How were we doing in the fleet? Looking around and keeping the boat balanced the way I actually wanted it. The sheet hand was hands full with a 15-meter sheet. There's a lot of rope to pull in and out when you're jibing or when you're coming on the wind or when you're running off. So the sheet hand was fully occupied there, but they also could work the kicking strap. So that left the skipper, and he is steering the boat up, and we assume we're coming up to a weather mark. We're going to round the mark. We've got all sorts of people around us, and there's various rules and things that are going to apply. So we've got to really make decisions quickly, and we've got to adjust the sails quickly. And one of the things I would do is let off the kicker, let off the downhaul, which was there. So that was my job. And the other thing was to get the plate up quickly and get away or alter the plate, whilst the sheet hand was balancing the boat and also playing the sail and making the boat go. In my opinion, the sheet hand wins the race in most situations because they're the people who get the speed out of the boat and get the max on, and some very good sheet hands on the Shannon. So that's the reason why the kicker was rigged that way, and not the downhaul and the centerboard. Now, I think all ropes were color coded in the 81, so that if you couldn't remember the right word, as I'm having trouble at the moment, at least you could remember the color. The other thing was they were only the minimum length required, so there was no surplus rope. They were just long enough to do the job. And the current boat that I share, I left the jib sheet 1 foot too short, and that has caused huge problems and has had to be replaced because it's very critical. But it's not 1 foot too long. On the ends of the downhaul and on the end of the plate, I had a wooden knob so that you could grab that and pull it quickly. The next thing is I used Horgan blocks on the boat, or they always had roller bearing or ball bearings in them for the minimum amount of friction. Oars and rowlocks were stowed under the side benches. Tow straps, these were checked each season. And on one occasion, I had neglected to do this, and we were racing along mid-fleet, and we were coming from St. David's towards Urra, and I did a very ungentlemanlike maneuver and went out backwards over the side and disappeared into the Shannon, letting go the tiller at the same time. So my good crew at the time, Sophie, decided to have a union meeting with the other member of the crew and decide whether they'd go back and collect me. Unfortunately, they did. And I was able to climb in again. I made the mistake of trying to climb in over the side of a Shannon. You can't do it. Now, there's quite a lot of reason to get back into the boat, apart from the fact that I was wet. So then I got round to the stern and I managed to heave myself in, because you can get your hands forward to the aft thwart and you can really get yourself in. I think the others might have helped me as well. I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. So then we went on. We'd lost 3 places, but we had to beat the 167, he of the lump hammer, and we just beat him. And I think we won the Silver Fleet or something, which was really mid-fleet stuff. So buoyancy bags. Buoyancy bags definitely need to be tied in. And I've shown you the photograph to point that out. And in the 81, they were tied in, and all the ties were 4mm nylon going through 25mm straps, and the nylon went in underneath each rib. So you could virtually lift that boat up by lifting up one of the buoyancy bags. That was the way I tied them in. And they had to be kept inflated. So we did that. The third hand likes a rope, if nothing else, to hold on to. It gives them confidence. And I think Andrew Mannion actually has one. I think he said for his for the helmsman, the sheet hand is obviously holding on to the main sheet, but it actually helps you if you're a bit worried about getting wet, if you're holding on to something, it feels nicer. At this stage, we're getting to the end of the rigging, and we'll just deal with a few things. Bucket tied in. Spare ties, always had a few spare ties. Over my sailing career, the number of times I had to grab a short piece of rope and repair something that had broken was particularly things like stays. I actually haven't mentioned stays, but the stays on the 81 had an interesting history. My father went to Belfast to the Shorts Brothers aircraft factory on business back in the 50s, and he saw this heap of scrap wire lying in the corner. I said, "What happens to that?" And the fellow said, "Oh, it's tipped out." We said, "Could I have a few?" So he got the makings, I think 12 shrouds, and he brought them back. They had beautiful aircraft quality splices, pieces crimped onto them. And I put those on the 81. The 81, I never altered the stays. If they got a bit stretched, as wire will do eventually, I used to put in an extra shackle, a shorter shackle. So I only had 2 shackles, one slightly longer than the other. The top was around the mast. Now, one thing, if you are using wire, you actually need to use flexible stainless steel wire, because the stiff wire, which is normally used for standing rigging on yachts, cracks and eventually will break, and it's not good. Spare shackles, yes, to carry those. A shackle opener, yes, also tied into the boat. Sun cream, vital. Sunglasses, pretty vital, particularly in good weather. A water bottle, all tied in. Clothing, minimum amount of clothing, not to be taken too literally, girls, but I always wore shorts and as lighter clothing, a waterproof jacket of some sort or a heavier one if it was windy, and a buoyancy aid and a wristwatch. And the only other final thing was that when you take over the boat, throw out last year's junk. It's all like the lady's handbag, it needs frequent emptying. Maybe we'd go on to the next slide before I offend too many more people. So the first thing in racing, as you can see, this is a long distance race and it is a glorious day and there's not much wind and we're leaving Athlone. We're out to enjoy ourselves. That was the priority. And every time we went sailing, that was the first thing I would say to the crew. If you're not going to enjoy yourselves, why the hell are you out there? You're not being paid to. We race against the next couple of boats wherever we are in the race. You can always have a race against the other boats. You may not be winning, but you might be second and third last, but at least you can get a race, and that's what it's all about. Go to the next slide, please. We aim to be in the top 10 boats. Now, I can't show you the other ones, but these are just 2 Goodbody boats, and I thought you might like to see them. And it's quite interesting to look at the sails there, and I haven't said anything about sails. I'm going to explain that later. The 81 sail seems to have less creases than the 142, but that's quite interesting. But it's just a nice photograph. The next principle we had, having been out to enjoy ourselves and racing against other boats, we aimed to be in the top 10 boats. A place was a bonus. And then if we go to 15, please. Your next slide. If you're winning, we celebrated. And the win was a real bonus. And that's the way we sailed. So now I have a few other photographs just to show you some of the things that were fun. This was quite an interesting photograph. I'm attacking this boat here to lee. And there were 3 of us in the race, and somebody else took this photograph. That's why you can see actually myself steering there. And we're roaring along with the other on the clear side. And I actually managed to sail through those other 2 boats, and there were 5 photographs in the sequence, and it was really quite interesting. Why I did, I don't know. 81 just went faster. Next slide, please. I just thought that this was rather a nice photograph, and it shows some of the excitement you can have with these boats. Obviously, they don't need a crew, they can sail without them. Next slide, please. That's another photograph of when these boats are flying along the clear shore again, and it's a great action shot, and it just gives some of the thrill of it. Another photograph, please. This is one of my favorite photographs. I want to take your name and address for letting me down and causing me to fill the boat up. But normally when I was a small boy, I was supposed to get wet and my parents were supposed to keep dry. I think we better go on to the next one. Yes, I just wonder what Tony is saying, if you could see that photograph. It's a really interesting thing. And I like the third hand, who really is diving for something to hold on to, but it's quite spectacular. Next one, please. Oh, well, obviously the third hand wasn't in the right place there. So I think that's another example of a jibe. The camera is a fascinating thing to have at this particular point in the course, particularly in a windy day. And towards the latter few years, you might have noticed that I had given up trying to keep these bloody things upright, and I've been in and out of them enough times, and that I would go and take the camera and take some photographs. And we had some great fun doing that, but it had to be a windy day, and it had to be a really good squall coming up to get the best shot. So we'll go on to the next photograph, please. This is a boat going flat out, and it was a day when they were out racing. You see it's reefed, and there's nothing like this. It's just great fun. Is that the last one, Naomi? It is. All right, just put it back up again. I want you to read something now briefly, and then it'll only take a couple of minutes. But my father kept a log, and he kept all the details of 1948 and 1959. I'm going to read you an extract out of it. This sums up the excitement these boats can be. The wind had been steadily freshening all day, and by 3 o'clock it was coming in vicious squalls from the south. There was very little wave due to the fact there was an offshore wind. This was fortunate, as otherwise I doubt if any boat would have finished. We in 61 started in the lee and held the inside position at the first mark, lying at the time about 6th. I got my sheets in quickly, and Mary, that's Mary Hooker, put her helm down and we rounded the mark. We did a perfect jibe and shot past 2 boats into 4th place. I got a quick look back and saw a scene of disaster and shipwreck behind us. The crash boat was kept busy for some time after. We reached to Urra and got rather involved with 64. Mary got heated with A.G. Waller, and I had eventually tell her to stop nattering and sail the so-and-so boat. We held our position, beating to the goose, and when we eased sheets, lay 4th with 37 leading, then 64 with 44 and ourselves hot on their heels. It was a terrific run, planing nearly all the time. I saw 53 behind us lift and into the air, and with a cloud of white broken water behind her. I thought she was up on her transom, but we got 61 up ourselves and left them. We'd boom in and out of water most of the time, as had A.G. Waller in front. A.G. was roaring with excitement, and the whole party was at the biggest thrill that I've had for a very long time. We at last were round to the Urra mark and close hauled for Kilteela. We got 53 under our lee, and Mary held him there. We shook him off pretty soon. We were all about as far out as we go, with Betty's hair trailing in the water. The scenes of conclusion on the second time round was frightening, with filled and capsized boats littering the course. Poor Jim Brown was clinging to the wreck of 32. 48 was over in front of a goose. 44 lost their third hand overboard, rescued her and carried on to finish 2nd. We got in 4th with the boat dry, 1 minute 47 seconds behind 37. 17 boats started, 9 finished. And I think that sums up the fantastic life I've had sailing these boats and the great fun I've had with the people who've been kind enough to sail with me. Thank you very much. If anybody likes questions, we'll go. Thank you, Naomi.
Great, thank you, Reggie. If anyone does have a question or a comment, please unmute yourself.
Reggie, I love the extract from your father's diary, and it really shows how timeless these boats are. You could have written that kind of in recent years. All the names would have been different. The boats somewhat the same, and the expressions all absolutely the same. I think it's absolutely fantastic, but it reflects so much of why we all keep doing this and how timeless it is.
Thank you.
I think Harman is about to, perhaps.
Please be.
Yeah. Harman, we can't hear you.
Okay, I'll go next. Reggie, I just wanted to say I'm in complete agreement with your favourite photo. There's nothing quite like seeing a sodomy in Crofton, you know, clambering back into his boat. Fair play.
Anyone else? Any questions?
Harman, you have to unmute yourself.
Where's Anne?
Where's Anne? Where's Anne?
Unmute. Am I free now?
Yes.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh yes. Well, just to say, having moved from being third hand back to being skipper, and then gradually made my way back up to the bow of the boat, how jolly enjoyable it is at my advanced age to be third hand. But I have learned one thing as third hand.
Oh no. Harman.
Fun again.
Just mute everybody.
Sorry. Harman, you just have to unmute. There we are.
Ils me l'ont envoyé suite à l'envoi de ma liasse fiscale.
Harman?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, for the third time, having started as third hand and made my weary way down to being skipper and then gradually being relegated back to third hand again, I have some advice for third hands, which is this: when the skipper says, should we tack, or what should we do next, or where should we go, you're best not to be committal in your answer, because whatever disaster ensues, you'll get blamed for it. Whereas if you don't say anything except, they look to be doing well over there, or something like that, something vague, then you avoid the awful responsibility of invariably giving the wrong advice.
There you are.
So that's it. Except to say how much I enjoyed Reggie's very informative and indeed erudite talk on the construction of Shannon One Designs, which was very good. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Harman.
Bye-bye.
We just, in 81, we actually don't say ready about, as they did in the grand old days of yacht sailing. We just say we're going, go, and that was as quick as that. So that meant that the crew always had to concentrate. And one of the things about racing these things is you have to concentrate up to the very last, and you can pick up a good few places in the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it happens to be. So go ready about was never said in the 80s. I think Sophie will back me up.
Super.
Reggie, when we sail with, when Sheila and I sail with Frank, we have a different procedure. It's after the fact. Say, I think he tacked. But the other thing I was going to say was, you were saying that you put on your undercoat and then you put on 2 coats of top coat. All the old guys in the, not that you're an old guy, all the old guys in the George, the boatman and everything, they used to put on, they called half and half, and that's what we use. After the first after the undercoats and all the filling and all that, they put on half of top coat and half of undercoat, and it actually gives a better sticky. But I'm not sure about.
Yes,
Yeah, it'll be a slightly matter looking finish. It probably look nicer. It's hard to say. I don't know. We always use the international paint system, and I could get good finishes on that. We'll keep off the subject of polyurethane, but that's a different game altogether.
Oh, no, sorry, Reggie. What I meant was they put on half and half after the undercoat, and then they put on a top coat.
Yeah, well, I don't know. That's some black magic that they obviously had in the water.
Yeah.
I'm not privy to.
Great. Any final comments or questions? Just there's a comment from Sophie she says she has a poor internet connection, but she just wanted to say, Reggie, that you've always been very encouraging to new members to the sod fleet. And she absolutely loved the teaching and was great fun you always had on the 81. So great.
I have a question, if you don't mind, Naomi. It was a brilliant talk, Reggie. Thanks. Really enjoyed it. I was curious, you meant when you were talking about the aircraft shrouds or stainless steel shrouds, but you mentioned that if you're using wire, I was curious, are there other options, or is it always wire?
Well, the modern materials, Spectra is probably stronger than wire, weight for weight, and certainly for any running rigging, it's very usable. I mean, my eyes were really opened. I was going up the Rhine there a few years ago, and they were using Spectra mooring ropes with the Rhine current. The Spectra mooring ropes were the diameter of my little finger, and they were holding these massive barges in the current, so that it's immensely strong material. It could probably be used for stays, I don't know. You can splice it, and I have spliced it quite frequently on the squib, and you can make a nice looking splice. But it's very light, but sometimes it has to be protected against sunlight. I think that's one of its problems, I don't know. But certainly flexible wire will do the job on the rigging. You need, around the top of the mast, you need to put a piece of plastic covering, plastic tubing, because otherwise wire and Spectra will cut into the timber at the top of mast. Another thing you can do there is put a little small ring of plastic or even rope or anything at all to fit around the top of the mast, and that will stop the wires slicing into the timber, but they will slice into the timber.
Super.
Reggie, a question?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I have a feeling that there was a tradition that the shrouds on the 61 were put in place by Uffa Fox, and that your father taped them up after that. They did very well, apparently, and taped them up after that. And I seem to remember a sort of sticking plaster tape around the two shrouds so that they couldn't be adjusted, if you see what I mean.
Well,
does that mean anything? Or is that a myth?
We have come across a diary, which Eric was listening there, he's now gone, but my father describes going to the Dinghy Week in 1952, and Uffa Fox apparently sailed with them for 3 days.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful part where he told my mother to put her cheeks out, and he didn't mean cheeks of her face, because they could stay upright. I used a different word, but Uffa Fox did play around with the boat, and my father described starting last, which would be unlikely with Uffa in the boat, but they did, and finishing first. But I do remember my father saying that he never laughed so much in his whole sailing experience, because he was laughing for 2 reasons, and he was exhausted at the end of the week. He was exhausted because it blew very hard, and they all had to sit out very hard. And the other thing was he was Uffa's ribald humour and stories apparently were very entertaining, but and very funny. Uffa has, by the way, if you want some good reads, Uffa's books on sailing are very interesting, very funny.
I think DJ has a question.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Hi, Reggie. Hi, everybody. There were talks in the previous weeks about the position of the shrouds. I was wondering what your opinions were on that. I didn't know any pros or cons myself.
When we go back to these famous shrouds, they shrouds, I think, a hand span from the little finger to the front, back from the center of the mast, I think is the correct place for a shroud. But Noel Dunner is definitely listening, and he probably knows exactly where they go in a measurement form. But originally, they were much closer to the mast, and the mast used to get beyond the shroud when it was very windy, and then all the load of the sail, trying to push 1/4 of a ton of a boat, plus today probably 300 kilo of crew, is actually needs quite a lot of effort. And that's all been taken out of a small spar, which is about the diameter of my hand. In other words, 3 inches, the mast. So there's a huge load comes. And it also is putting that load into the bow thwart. And I was talking about that at the very beginning. And that's not very good. So in the wisdom, the class decided to move those shrouds back. Now, occasionally the masts do actually still go ahead of the things. 81 always was rigged with slack stays or slack shrouds, and she certainly went better that way. And I never adjusted them. I inherited them from my father, and the boat went. And if it's going, you know, don't fix it if it's going well. And the boat, the 81, I could make going well. 81 on when I sailed it, I could most of the time sail it with my thumb and my first finger holding the tiller extension. I never had to pull it hard, except maybe maneuvering or something like that. But when you were beating, that was the way she sailed. She was just worked.
Reggie.
Certainly, yes.
Reggie, John Lefroy here. It was my understanding that the original design was the chain plates were well back as we use them now. They will move forward in the 30s and 40s so that the boats would run better. But when we applied bigger sails, etc., the forward position, we, as you say, weakened the support of the shrouds, and we got a lot of broken masts. And that's when, in the early 70s, they were moved back to the present and proper position. And it was my hand span which came up with the thumb to forefinger or middle finger as the proper position.
Yeah, I've never heard. I think once the angle is under 12 degrees, it doesn't work from a naval architect's point of view. But John, I'm sure you're right. I mean, people have played around with this boat so many times that it's hardly recognizable compared to the boat that I sailed in 1950.
Mm.
Reggie, there's a question coming in on the chat from Colin Galvin. So he's just asking, what is a Scotch gunnel?
All right, a Scotch gunnel is, you have the outside, the top strake, then you have the ribs inside that, and inside that you have a gunnel. The Scotch gunnel is where the ribs come right up and finish flush with the top of the gunnel and the top of the top mahogany strake. The old, a lot of the boats were built, and a lot of rowing boats are still built, with the ribs finishing beneath the gunnel. So the gunnel is actually narrow. And nearly all the new boats now have Scotch gunnels. Does that answer that?
Perfect.
I can probably show you something. Hold on.
Now you're showing off, Reggie.
Oh, he's gone. All right, there you are. Scotch gunnels. You can see them there, the gaps in between.
Great.
Having very loose stays.
Sorry, I missed that.
What is the logic of having very loose stays? Because it just means that the mast then bends and more of the load goes on the bow thwart?
Yeah, I think the stays of the 81, as far as I remember, were just taking up. They were taking up when the mast is going forward. Now, the thing is, there's a slot on the bottom, and therefore, originally my father in his diary says that he used to put wooden blocks in there to keep the mast wedged in position. Then he got rid of that. Now I think a mast should actually be free totally to move whichever way it wants, and it is controlled by the stays. So 81 just worked. The mast would go forward, then the stays would take the load. But none of the load was taken at the bottom. You're right about a certain amount of it being taken on the thwart, but there's more of it taken on the thwart if the bottom, the aft end of the mast, is restricted from going further aft. Do you understand? It's rather difficult to explain.
Thank you.
And and when she's on the wind, well, then obviously the load is coming on the windward shroud and the forestay. The forestay I didn't have. I had 4 shackled, and I used to take one out occasionally if I remember, but quite often I didn't.
Any final questions or comments?
A very quick one. In terms of pressure points, when you attach the bottom of the kicker, would you endorse attaching it to the bottom of the mast or to the hull itself?
Can you just repeat that, please, Rachel? Sorry, I missed the first bit.
In terms of attaching the kicker, the bottom of the kicker, would you endorse attaching it to the hull or the mast from a pressure point of view?
Oh, I would definitely, I would have it entirely to the bottom of the mast. And if you look at a modern dinghy, you actually see, in fact, I was looking at the club a couple of days ago, the kicking strap is coming from the mast down to the boom. It doesn't touch the boat at all. And in yachts, it's the same thing. I would certainly have it, not only did it go to the mast, but it kept the same, didn't allow the boom to come up. If you have it on a fitting to the bottom attached to the step, as the mast swings out, it tends to tighten the kicking strap because the angle isn't true. So, as far as I'm concerned, always the bottom of the mast. And the downhaul, I think, should be attached to the bottom, to that bolt, so that when it, the downhaul is just, it's not pushing the mast into the bottom of the boat. One final thought, which you might be interested in, where having been capsized a few times in my life, it would be an interesting idea to actually put rubber slots on the top of the centerboard box to stop the water coming in when you're trying to bail the bloody thing out. It doesn't affect the performance of the boat, but it does allow the boats to bail them out. I had another photograph of a certain family with father bailing away vigorously, but I didn't show it. I might do next time.
Super. Okay. We think we're done, are we? Any last call? No. Okay, great. Thank you very much, Reggie.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Reggie.
That was
Thank you, Reggie. Fantastic talk, but also terrific pictures.
Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you, Reggie.
Bye.